If you've ever driven the logging highways of British Columbia, you've seen a Western Star, the long hood, the star badge, a truck built for mountain terrain where loaded rigs come down with their brakes glowing in the dark. Behind that silhouette was a factory in Kelowna, where over 1,300 workers hand-built 31 of them every day. They survived the collapse of their American parent company, survived a decade under owners who didn't understand the truck business, survived near death, and came back as a billion-dollar enterprise on the Toronto Stock Exchange. And then, after 35 years of building trucks in the Okanagan Valley, the plant fell silent for the last time. How does a factory that survived all of that simply disappear? Chapter 1. The Sewing Machine's Son. The story begins not in the Okanagan Valley, but in Cleveland, Ohio, in a workshop where a man named Rollin Henry White was trying to build a better steam boiler. His father, Thomas, had made a fortune manufacturing sewing machines. Rollin wanted engines. In 1900, he and his brothers Windsor and Walter produced a steam-powered automobile, the White Steamer. And within 6 years, the family had organized the White Motor Car Company on Canal Street in Cleveland's industrial flats. The transition from parlor sewing machines to heavy trucks took barely a decade. White shifted entirely to truck production during the First World War and emerged from it as the largest truck manufacturer in the United States. By the 1920s, the name White was stamped on more commercial vehicles than any competitor in America. The company grew the way American industrial giants grew in the middle of the 20th century, by buying everything in sight. White acquired Autocar in 1953, adding cab-over-engine designs to its stable. It picked up the Diamond REO line. It moved into farm equipment with the Oliver Corporation. And critically, from 1951 to 1977, White held the exclusive distribution agreement for Freightliner trucks, built by Consolidated Freightways, a deal that put White's dealer network at the center of the North American heavy truck market, even for trucks it didn't build. Sales climbed from $130 million in 1950 to $770 million by 1967. White Motor sat comfortably among the big four American truck makers, alongside Mack, International, and Packer's Kenworth Peterbilt empire. But the western half of the continent had a problem that Cleveland couldn't solve from Cleveland. Weight limits in British Columbia, Alberta, and the Pacific Northwest states were lower than in the east. Logging companies running loads down mountain forest service roads needed a different truck. Lighter, tougher, more customizable than anything rolling off White's eastern assembly lines. Freightliner had captured part of the lightweight niche, but only in cab-over-engine form. What the Western market wanted was a conventional long-hood truck, built light enough to meet the regulations, and strong enough to haul old-growth Douglas fir down grades that would kill a standard highway rig. In 1967, White Motor opened a purpose-built assembly plant in Kelowna, British Columbia, and called the division White Western Star. The choice of Kelowna was strategic in ways that only made sense if you understood the geography. Highway 97 ran south through the Okanagan Corridor into BC's interior logging country and onward to the Pacific Northwest, the heart of the customer base. Tax advantages made importing American-built components and assembling them in Canada financially attractive. And Kelowna itself, a small city of roughly 19,000 people at the edge of a post-war forestry boom, offered a labor pool eager for industrial wages in a province whose social credit government under W.A.C. Bennett was aggressively promoting resource industrialization. Dams were going up on the Columbia and the Peace River. BC Hydro was building the electrical backbone of the interior. The province wanted factories beyond Vancouver, and White Motor wanted a plant close to the men who'd buy the trucks. The first Western Stars rolled off the line with comfort cabs sourced from Autocar and signature fiberglass tilt hoods designed to save every pound that regulations demanded. The 4900 series, introduced in 1968, became the flagship, a conventional that logging operators across British Columbia adopted as the default tool for moving timber out of the bush. The 4800 vocational series followed in 1971. The plant grew to 250,000 square feet of manufacturing space plus 50,000 square feet of warehousing, and the trucks it produced carved out a reputation that transcended their branch plant origins. Because that's what Kelowna was, a branch plant. Not a research center, not a headquarters, not the place where decisions were made. A Canadian assembly operation reporting to Cleveland, building vehicles to an American specification for a regional market. The paychecks came, the trucks went out the door, and the fate of every worker on that floor depended entirely on the health and judgment of a parent company, 2 time zones, and a national border away. Chapter 2. The Orphan on Enterprise Way. The health of that parent company was already failing. White Motor's fateful mistake was Euclid, Inc., an off-highway hauler manufacturer it acquired in 1968, taking on enormous debt to close the deal. A planned 1970 merger with White Consolidated Industries, the spun-off sewing machine business, collapsed. The company was bleeding. In 1971, White's board brought in Seaman Bunky Knudsen to save it. Knudsen had credentials. He was the son of General Motors legend William Big Bill Knudsen, and he'd served as president of Ford before being pushed out by Henry Ford II. He arrived in Cleveland with a mandate to restructure. He sold a third of White's assets, including the profitable Euclid division. He moved headquarters from the downtown Erie View Tower to suburban Eastlake. He cut employment and consolidated truck production from the East 79th Street Cleveland plant to Virginia. White posted a $20 million profit in 1973, but it couldn't hold. By 1979, White had sold its farm equipment division to a Texas firm, and the company that had once been America's largest truck maker was running out of road. On September 4, 1980, White Motor Corporation filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection in the Northern District of Ohio. Case 80-13361, with approximately $1 billion in unsecured debt. It was the largest Chapter 11 filing in American history at that point. Between September 1980 and December 1981, the company lost a further $311 million. Chairman Wallace B. Askins later disclosed an additional $28 million loss for 1982. Years of mismanagement, coupled with inflation, recession, and an industry shifting beneath its feet, had finally caught the company its founder had built from a sewing machine workshop 8 decades earlier. And in Kelowna, 1,200 kilometers from the nearest White Motor office, the workers on Enterprise Way waited. The bankruptcy court in Ohio began carving up the carcass through 1981. On March 14th, a court order sold the truck manufacturing operations of the White Motor Corporation of Canada, including the Kelowna plant, the Western Star brand, and the dealer network, to a joint venture of 2 Calgary-based energy companies, Bow Valley Industries and Novacorp, each taking 50%. The same order moved White's Canadian farm equipment operations to a TIC Linamar joint venture. In April, White's Australian subsidiary went to Silchester Holdings. In August, the U.S. truck plants went to AB Volvo of Sweden, which formed Volvo White Truck Corporation, and eventually merged it with GM's heavy truck division to create the White GMC brand. White Motor Corporation itself ceased to exist in 1985. The Pension Benefit Guarantee Corporation pursued the estate for $46 million in unfunded pension benefits and settled for $15 million. The Kelowna plant survived, but the story of how it survived needs correcting. This wasn't a management buyout. It wasn't the shop floor rising up to save what was theirs. The rescuers were Alberta oilmen at the peak of the Western energy boom, looking for industrial diversification. Novacorp and Bow Valley saw a heavy truck company whose core customers, logging operators, oil field haulers, miners, were their own industry neighbors, and they wrote the check. Kelowna's workers kept their jobs not because they'd taken their fate into their own hands, but because 2 companies in Calgary had surplus capital and a logical reason to spend it. For a decade, it held. Western Star produced trucks under Alberta ownership through the 1980s, maintaining the Kelowna plant and its reputation for hand-built durability. But resource companies aren't truck companies. By the late 1980s, as oil prices softened and the original investment logic faded, Bow Valley and its successor entity Bovar Inc. and Novacorp grew tired of the truck business. The division was experiencing severe difficulties. The Kelowna plant was a viable asset that its owners no longer wanted. The genuine phoenix arrived from the other side of the Pacific. Terry Peabody was an American-born, Australian-domiciled businessman whose father had been a peripatetic civil contractor, a man who moved around a lot, instilling in his son an appetite for risk and an instinct for undervalued assets. Peabody had already built a fortune through Trans-Pacific Holdings, a waste management company that would eventually become a billion-dollar enterprise. His partner, Bob Shand, was the former boss of White Trucks Australia, a man who'd bought tooling at a white motor bankruptcy auction and who understood the Western Star product down to the last rivet. Together, they'd founded Western Star Trucks Australia in 1983 at Wacol, Queensland, assembling trucks from Canadian CKD packs. They sold 53 trucks in their first year. In 1991, Peabody agreed to buy the entire Western Star parent company from Novacorp and Bovar. Australian trade press described the price as a token amount with help from the Canadian government. Annual sales stood at $131 million. Peabody restructured debt, slashed operating costs, and shed offices in Ontario and Tennessee. He refused any salary or cash bonus after 1997, taking only stock options, an owner who'd bet everything on the company he'd bought for nearly nothing. This was the rescue the story needed. Not Alberta Oil Capital parking money in an industrial holding. A man and his partner who knew the trucks, who'd sold them on the other side of the world, who walked onto the Kelowna factory floor and understood what they had. Chapter 3. Hand-built in wine country. What they had was something that shouldn't have existed. A small batch, hand-built heavy truck operation in a city better known for apple orchards and lake resorts, producing 31 trucks a day in a market dominated by companies building thousands. The Okanagan Valley in the 1990s was already beginning its transformation. Vineyards were creeping up the slopes south of Kelowna, around Naramata and Oliver and West Kelowna. Okanagan Lake drew tourists and retirees. The dry climate hills, the warm summers, the lakefront. This was wine country, retirement country, vacation country. And wedged into the Enterprise Way industrial corridor, a 250,000 square feet of factory floor shook with the assembly of some of the heaviest, most purpose-built diesel trucks on the continent. That contradiction was the soul of the place. Walk the streets of downtown Kelowna in 1997, and you'd pass real estate offices advertising lake views and boutique wineries. Drive 10 minutes north along Enterprise Way, and you'd find welders, machinists, and powertrain engineers putting together logging rigs destined for the BC bush. Trucks that would spend their working lives on unpaved Forest Service roads, hauling loads of old-growth cedar down mountain grades so steep the brakes glowed at night. The same city, two entirely different economies sharing the same postal code. Under Peabody, Western Star doubled down on the thing that set it apart: customization. Every truck that left Kelowna was built to the individual buyer's specification. This wasn't a metaphor, it was literal. In an era when Freightliner and International were investing hundreds of millions in automated assembly and standardized platforms, Western Star's Kelowna workers were hand-fitting cabs, hand-routing wiring harnesses, and hand-finishing interiors to whatever the customer wanted. Showers, microwave ovens, waterbeds. Peabody described the product to the Globe and Mail as a home away from home. And he wasn't exaggerating. For owner-operators who lived in their trucks for weeks at a time, running oil field loads across northern Alberta, or logging routes through the interior, the cab was a bedroom, a kitchen, and an office. The Constellation series, launched in 1998, introduced a completely new cab and sleeper that represented the pinnacle of that philosophy. The 4864 FXC, the 4964 FXC, the 4964E XC. Each model built around the idea that a truck this expensive, running in conditions this severe, should feel like something its driver chose rather than something a fleet manager assigned. The Starlight Sleeper, with its polypropylene honeycomb core, was a signature engineering achievement. Lighter, better insulated, and more durable than anything the volume manufacturers offered. John Tomlinson joined Western Star in 1992 as a junior engineer in the powertrain department. He remembers his first day. "I remember the supervisor I was working for walked me past the order board and said, 'If it ever gets below 300, you have to worry.' 300 outstanding orders. That was the threshold between confidence and anxiety. And in the Peabody years, the board stayed healthy. Tomlinson would spend more than 3 decades with Western Star. He's still there today, heading the XD off-road line at Daimler Truck North America. But the Kelowna years are the ones that defined his career. A small team, building trucks by hand, in a factory where you knew every face on the floor. The financial transformation under Peabody was staggering. Revenue grew from $131 million in 1992 to $1.8 billion by 1999, roughly a 14-fold expansion in 7 years. Western Star Trucks Holdings listed on the Toronto Stock Exchange. Peabody held 42% of the equity and, true to his word, drew no salary from the company after 1997. Analyst Winnie Seo at Salmon Partners set a 1-year share price target of $37. The stock closed at $23 on the TSX in late 1999, climbing steadily. The product line expanded with the ambition. The 5900 Aero tractor targeted highway owner-operators who wanted Western Star durability without the vocational-only image. The 6900, in twin-steer and extreme-duty configurations, attacked mining and heavy construction markets. The 3800 medium-duty truck addressed urban delivery. In 1995, Peabody acquired Ontario Bus Industries, renaming it Orion Bus Industries, a transit bus manufacturer with plants in Mississauga and Oriskany, New York. In 1996, he bought ERF Ltd., the British heavy truck maker, briefly producing the Western Star Commander 7564F cab-over engine on the ERF platform, before selling ERF to Mayan in 2000. A joint venture with Mexico's Consorcio G Grupo Dina aimed to build a Class 7 medium-duty truck, the Solar Series, with projected volumes of 8,000 units a year. And the Canadian Armed Forces contracted Western Star to build the LSVW, the Light Support Vehicle, wheeled, a military utility truck based on the Iveco VM90 platform. None of this was supposed to be possible. Western Star held 2 to 3% of the North American Class 8 market. It was building 31 trucks a day in a single plant, while Freightliner, its eventual owner, commanded 36% of the market across multiple factories. PACCAR's combined Kenworth-Peterbilt operation held roughly a quarter. Volvo and Mack together controlled another 20%. International filled the mass market tier. Western Star competed against every one of them with a workforce of 1,300 and a reputation built on the premise that some trucks shouldn't be built like every other truck. The workers who built them earned up to $22 an hour. The best-paying industrial jobs in Kelowna, according to Stan Richthal, the International Association of Machinist business representative who bargained for approximately 450 of the plant's unionized employees. At peak, the Kelowna site employed between 1,250 and 1,326 people. These weren't assembly line button pushers. They were skilled tradespeople, welders, electricians, machinists, paint technicians, building complex heavy machines to individual specification in a process that demanded judgment and experience at every station. And then there was Australia. Peabody's home turf became Western Star's second-largest market. Australian road trains operate at gross combination masses up to 200 tons, running across outback distances that make BC's logging routes look suburban. The heavy conventional design that Western Star had perfected for Canadian conditions, the long hood, the reinforced frame, the oversized cooling systems, translated perfectly to Australian service. Western Star Trucks Australia, the company Peabody and Shand had founded in 1983, would eventually sell more than 15,000 trucks on the Australian market. The heritage models from the early years, the 4864 and 4964, offered with package names like Cheyenne, Apache, Comanche, Chinook, Mohawk, Pawnee, and Navajo, became collectors' icons in Australian trucking culture. The Kelowna plant wasn't just building trucks, it was building an argument. That scale wasn't everything. That a 1,300-person factory in wine country could produce a product that the biggest manufacturers in the world couldn't match. Chapter 4. 300 on the board. By fiscal 1999, the argument appeared to be winning. Record quarterly profit of $12.8 million, 90 cents a share, for the quarter ending September 30th, 1999. Revenue on track to hit $1.8 billion for the fiscal year. A brand new 460,000 square foot plant in North Charleston, South Carolina, commissioned in March 2000, with capacity for 20,000 trucks annually. The TSX share price climbing. Peabody's personal stake worth well north of $100 million. 214 dealers across the network. 3,100 employees across the corporate group. The BC government had placed its own bet. In 1999, the province invested $60 million in Western Star preferred shares, 600,000 shares, plus a commitment to spend a further $25 million on employee training over 10 years. The deal was negotiated against competing offers from 8 American states willing to provide employment grants, training subsidies, and tax delays. Mark Lofthouse, director of BC's Ministry of Employment and Investment, sat on the Western Star board. The province wanted those Kelowna jobs, and it paid to keep them. But Kelly Platt, who would later become Western Star's brand president at Daimler Truck North America, understood the precariousness better than the balance sheet suggested. She was on the due diligence committee that would soon examine Western Star before Daimler bought it, and her retrospective is the most revealing testimony in the record. Western Star had a rocky ride in the 80s and 90s. It went through multiple sets of ownerships. There was more than one Friday when employees went home and were told the auditors had the locks and keys and probably were going to shut the place down over the weekend. So don't expect to come back to work Monday morning. That fragility hid behind the record profits. By mid-1999, Western Star had already cut Kelowna production from 31 to 20 trucks a day and laid off 200 workers, 150 hourly, 50 salaried, blaming an industry-wide reduction in demand for Class 8 trucks. The North American truck market was beginning the cyclical downturn that would become a full collapse by 2001. The cuts were a warning that the boardroom heard differently from the shop floor. And Peabody, 60 years old in 1999, had begun positioning for an exit. The Charleston plant, the TSX listing, the financial performance. All of it made Western Star not just a successful company, but a purchasable one. The man who'd bought a failing truck business for a token amount was building something worth $1 billion to the right buyer. Whether the Kelowna workers understood that distinction between building a company to last and building a company to sell would only become clear in the months ahead. The order board was full, but the question John Tomlinson's supervisor had posed on his first day, if it ever gets below 300, you have to worry, was about to become the only question that mattered. Chapter 5. The Calculation. The North American Class. 8 truck market in the late 1990s was not a place where a 1,300-person factory could hide. Consolidation had been grinding through the industry for 2 decades, and by the time Western Star posted its record quarter, the map had already been redrawn. Daimler-Benz had bought Freightliner from Consolidated Freightways back in 1981, the same year Kelowna was orphaned from White Motor. By 2000, Daimler had added Sterling Trucks, Thomas-built buses, American LaFrance, and Detroit Diesel to the portfolio. Volvo had absorbed the remnants of White Motor itself, creating White GMC, and then swallowed Mack Trucks in 2000. PACCAR, parent of Kenworth and Peterbilt, acquired DAF in the Netherlands and Leyland in Britain. Navistar's international division held its ground as a fading independent. In the space of a single decade, the entire North American heavy truck industry had consolidated into effectively 3 companies, with Navistar as a weakening fourth. Each of those companies could absorb what Western Star could not: the cost of meeting the escalating EPA emissions tiers. The 1991 and 1994 and 1998 heavy-duty rules had already tightened standards. The 2002, 2004, and 2007 tiers would introduce cooled exhaust gas recirculation, diesel particulate filters, and selective catalytic reduction, technologies that required hundreds of millions of dollars in engine research and development. PACCAR could spread that cost across Kenworth and Peterbilt and DAF. Daimler could spread it across Freightliner and Sterling and Detroit Diesel. Volvo could spread it across 3 continents. Western Star, building 31 trucks a day in a single Okanagan plant, couldn't spread it at all. The company's reliance on outside engines, Detroit Diesel, Cummins, Caterpillar, insulated it partially from the R&D burden. But it also transferred power to its suppliers. And when Daimler acquired Detroit Diesel in 2000, one of Western Star's critical engine sources landed inside a competitor's house. The dealer network told the same story. Western Star operated through 214 dealers. Packer's combined Kenworth-Peterbilt network ran to roughly 800. Scale wasn't a preference. It was becoming a precondition for survival. Peabody read the numbers the way a man reads the weather when he's already decided to sell the farm. The Charleston plant, the ERF acquisition, the Mexican joint venture, the Orion bus division. All of it had expanded Western Star's reach, but none of it had solved the fundamental problem. A premium truck maker with single-digit market share could command beautiful per-unit pricing, but it couldn't command the procurement leverage, the emissions compliance budget, or the dealer infrastructure that the giants deployed as a matter of course. The question wasn't whether Western Star would be absorbed. The question was, by whom, and at what price? Kelly Platt put it with the clarity of someone who'd seen the books. Western Star trucks in the late 1990s were still being custom-built, largely by hand, in Kelowna, BC, while the major truck makers consolidated and pumped millions into modernizing production facilities and processes. That environment was not conducive to the survival of a small independent manufacturer. Not conducive to survival, a polite way of saying the math had turned fatal. Chapter 6. The German Offer and the Last Shift. On July 19, 2000, Freightliner LLC President Jim Heabey stood in front of a press conference and announced that Freightliner would offer $42 per share for all outstanding Western Star Trucks Holdings equity, a 34% premium over the previous TSX close of $34.95. The approximate equity purchase price was $670 million. With assumption of Western Star's debt, the total enterprise value reached approximately $1 billion. Peabody, controlling 42% of the stock, had already pledged his shares before the announcement. The Western Star board approved the deal, and Peabody told the press it came after considerable deliberation and consideration. He wasn't sentimental about it. Simultaneously, a Peabody-controlled entity purchased Western Star's Australian, New Zealand, and Asia-Pacific distribution operations, including MAN Australia, for $39 million Australian dollars, plus assumption of $36 million in debt. The man who'd bought a Canadian truck company for a token was keeping the distribution arm that would eventually sell to Roger Penske's Penske Australia in 2013 for $219 million Australian dollars. Heabey's stated motive was candid. It became increasingly important for us to take advantage of the opportunity to buy them before someone else did. The deal expanded Freightliner into the premium, severe-duty niche where Western Star competed against Kenworth and Peterbilt. "Look out, Peterbilt," Heabey joked to the trade press. Negotiations had lasted 5 months. Heabey later acknowledged that Peabody had been a formidable negotiator. The 1,250 Kelowna employees learned about the sale during their summer shutdown, reading about it in the local newspaper and hearing it on the radio. Western Star spokesman Doug Shand described the mood. "I guess they're a little mystified as they read about the deal and try to understand what's happening from an employee point of view. We certainly think it's positive." Heabey flew to Kelowna the day after the announcement for management and employee town hall meetings. The BC government, which had invested $60 million in preferred shares just a year earlier, converted 200,000 shares to common stock and had the remaining 400,000 redeemed. Mark Lofthouse estimated the province's profit at $17 to $19 million. A handsome return on paper. Cold comfort for what came next. The deal closed on September 26, 2000. Every Western Star share was now held by Daimler Chrysler through its Freightliner subsidiary. The Canadian flag had flown over the Kelowna plant from 1981 to 2000. It wouldn't fly again. 13 months later, the axe fell. On October 12, 2001, with the North American Class 8 market in collapse, Freightliner's new president, Rainer Schmuckel, Jim Heabey, had resigned under pressure on May 25, 2001, announced a comprehensive restructuring, 25% of the salaried workforce eliminated. 1,100 jobs. 3 plants closed. One of them was Kelowna. The man who confirmed the details to the press was Chief Operating Officer Roger Nielsen, a Kelowna native. Nielsen had grown up in the same city, whose largest industrial employer he was now shutting down. He acknowledged the irony to reporters without flinching. It's just by chance the 2 Canadian facilities were chosen. Like Portland, however, Kelowna is considered to be a highly desirable place to live. The other Canadian closure was a Thomas-built buses school bus plant in Woodstock, Ontario. 321 jobs gone. Nielsen explained the arithmetic. The Kelowna plant was running at 2,000 trucks a year, against a capacity of 11,000. Freightliner had discouraged the BC government from offering financial help to keep the plant open, because, as Nielsen put it, it would have made no difference. The expected annual savings from the full restructuring, $850 million by 2004. Against a number that size, 719 jobs in a city of 100,000 carried no weight in the spreadsheet. The final trucks rolled off the Kelowna line in September 2002. 719 hourly and salaried jobs ended. Stan Richthal, the IAM business agent who'd bargained for the unionized workers, told the Globe and Mail what everyone on the floor already knew. These are the best-paying jobs in town. Workers at the top of the scale had earned $22 an hour. The kind of money that bought a house in Kelowna, put kids through school, and kept the local economy turning. Nielsen offered relocation. "We'll be bringing some people from Kelowna to Portland," he said. "We hope to entice up to 20% of the workers at that facility to come to Oregon." In the end, somewhere between 100 and 150 employees made the move. Kelly Platt later recalled, more than 100. The rest were laid off into a local economy that had nothing comparable to offer. The closure radiated outward. Dale Armineau, owner of Monashee Manufacturing, had built steel brackets for Western Star trucks. "It is pretty scary," he told reporters. Reedco Metal Industries, Crown West Steel Fabricators, Northside Industries, a 6-person Dana Canada warehouse. The supplier ecosystem that had grown around the plant contracted or collapsed. Kelowna Mayor Walter Gray, who had publicly welcomed Daimler 15 months earlier, turned critical, blaming Freightliner's truck buyback program for suppressing demand. But the truth was simpler and more structural than any single policy. A 2,000-truck-a-year operation inside an 11,000-truck capacity building, inside a corporation that already ran the largest heavy truck network in North America, was a redundancy, not a priority. The closure was not punishment. It was arithmetic. Nielsen himself would rise through Daimler Truck North America to become its president and CEO from 2017 to 2021. The Kelowna boy who closed his hometown plant and climbed to the top of the company that absorbed it. He carried the decision with a public statement that tried to split the difference between corporate necessity and human cost. It was a tough decision to make, and we had many options. But a brand is not just a product, but also the people behind it. The people, however, were now in Portland, or looking for work, or leaving Kelowna. Chapter 7. The truck that went to Hollywood production moved to Portland, Oregon, with a $16 million investment in the existing Daimler plant on North Channel Avenue. The Western Star name stayed on the trucks. The 4900 series still rolled off the line. The brand's identity, premium, custom, severe duty, survived inside Daimler's portfolio as the high-end complement to Freightliner's volume play. In 2014, a Western Star 5700XE was selected as the new vehicle form for Optimus Prime in Transformers: Age of Extinction, replacing the Peterbilt 379 that had served the role in the first 3 films. The same truck returned for Transformers: The Last Night in 2017. The 5700XE, a highway tractor that would never have existed without the Constellation platform launched in Kelowna in 1998, became arguably the most watched Western Star ever produced. The irony was quiet, but unmistakable. The truck that represented Kelowna's engineering legacy to a global audience of hundreds of millions was built in Oregon by a German-owned corporation. The city that had designed it didn't get a credit. The X Series arrived in 2020, the 49X first, then the 47X, then the 57X, completing the family in 2022, replacing the Constellation platform entirely. Production was split between Portland and a second plant in Cleveland, North Carolina. The brand sat within Daimler Truck North America, itself a subsidiary of Daimler Truck AG, which had been spun off from the former Daimler AG in December 2021. In Australia, the customer base remained large enough to justify a dedicated model, the 48X, designed for B-double and road train work. More than 15,000 Western Stars had been sold on Australian roads by the end of 2013. Kelly Platt became Western Star's brand president, also serving as Daimler Truck North America's chief diversity officer. John Tomlinson, the junior engineer who'd walked past the order board on his first day in 1992, stayed with the brand through every transition, heading the new XD off-road line. The people behind the brand survived, even as the place that made them didn't. Terry Peabody pivoted to Trans-Pacific Industries, the waste management company that had been his other empire. It went public in 2004, peaked at $14.40 a share in 2007, and then the global financial crisis and over-leveraged acquisitions wrecked it. Warburg Pincus mounted a rescue. Peabody sold the commercial vehicle group, including the Western Star Australia distributorship he'd kept from the Daimler deal, to Penske Australia in 2013. Forbes had estimated his net worth at 1.05 billion Australian dollars in 2008. The man who'd bought a truck company for nothing and built it into a billion-dollar Canadian enterprise spent his later years in the waste business, an ocean away from the plant he'd saved. Chapter 8. Enterprise Way. The plant at 2076. Enterprise Way sat empty, not for a season, not for a few years while the market recovered and a new tenant was found. For 15 years. 23,500 square meters of manufacturing space on a 5.6-hectare parcel, silent from September 2002 to April 2017. In a city that was growing, Kelowna's population would pass 222,000 in the broader metropolitan area by 2021. The building where 1,300 people had once built trucks by hand stood vacant, surrounded by a landscape that had moved on entirely. The Okanagan completed its transformation in those years. The vineyards that had been creeping up the slopes in the 1990s became a full-blown wine industry, premium labels from Naramata and Oliver and West Kelowna commanding national and international attention. Tourism expanded. Retirees arrived. The tech sector grew. Kelowna became exactly what Roger Nielsen had described, a highly desirable place to live. The heavy truck plant on Enterprise Way was a relic from a different economy, a different idea of what the Okanagan was for. In June 2015, Lowe's filed a development permit to demolish the old warehouse and build a retail store. Then Lowe's acquired the Rona chain in 2016, reassessed its Canadian footprint, and the plan collapsed. The building survived by default. On April 3, 2017, U-Haul closed on the purchase. U-Haul BC President Horace Martin announced the building would become a U-Haul center, truck and trailer rentals, self-storage units, portable moving containers. The shell of the plant was preserved and adaptively reused. There is no heritage designation, no plaque, no memorial for the 1,300 workers or the trucks they built, or the 2 decades of independence that began with an Australian buying a dying company for a token and ended with a German corporation running the numbers. The building where Western Star trucks were hand-assembled, where John Tomlinson checked the order board, where Stan Richthal's members earned the best wages in the city, where welders fitted custom cabs with showers and waterbeds for drivers who'd live in them for weeks on the northern Alberta oil roads, is a place where people now store furniture between moves. The trucks still run. You can see them in the BC interior if you know what you're looking for. The long hood, the star badge, the unmistakable silhouette on a mountain logging road. Some are old enough to have rolled off the Kelowna line. Some are new enough to carry the X-Series designation and the Portland or Cleveland provenance. The brand survived. The factory didn't. The city doesn't need it anymore. And somewhere in Oregon, a Western Star comes off the line the same way one always did. Built heavier and tougher than the market strictly requires, for drivers who work in places where the road isn't really a road, And the load isn't something you'd trust to anything less. That much, at least, hasn't changed. What changed is the hands that build it, the town that holds it, and the name on the wall above the factory door. It isn't Canadian anymore.